British Ministry of Information created a poster that has since become famous. In big white letters on a red background, it says, "Keep calm and carry on." And it was meant to prepare the British people for the onslaught of air raids that they were going to be facing from the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force that would be bombing the British people. And the motto was to instill them to say, keep a stiff upper lip and prepare. You are Brits, you can hang in there, keep calm and carry on, and we will win the war, we will overcome. Now, to Christians, looking out at the world and all the chaos and craziness in our world today, we instead of saying keep calm and carry on because you have it in you, if we just pull together, we can do this together. Instead, we want to say keep calm and carry on because God is in charge of the universe. Because God is in charge of the universe. That is the reason we can keep calm and carry on. We're in a series right now called Knowing God, where we're talking about the attributes of God. And I want to talk about God's sovereignty. Sometimes people use the term God's providence. This idea that God is in charge of the universe. That is what we want to focus on. God's sovereignty. He is in charge of the universe. And I want to unpack that idea for you of God being in charge of the universe or God being sovereign over the universe. I want to unpack it in three simple truths that I think we mean when we say God is in charge or God is sovereign. The first truth that we mean is that God keeps everything running. God keeps everything running. Sometimes theologians call that God's preservation, meaning that God sustains the universe. Instead of thinking about our world as like a machine that God has wound up and is working all on its own and God's kind of watching, instead the Bible invites us to see the universe as constantly being sustained by God himself. The very functioning of our universe is owed to God's involvement. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, it says this about Jesus: "He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." And he's talking about the created universe, that through Jesus, in Jesus, the entire universe, molecules and atoms, electrons, all of that are being held together and sustained by God himself. I think it's helpful to think of God as pressing the refresh button on the universe every millisecond. If God were to withdraw his hand and say, I'm not going to sustain the universe one moment longer, it would collapse into utter chaos and be destroyed. God is keeping everything running. Why does that matter? It means that you and I should thank God for every moment that we are alive, for every moment the world keeps on ticking. It is because God is just that good and he keeps everything running. God is in charge. The second thing we mean when we say God is in charge is that God is behind everything that happens. God is behind everything that happens. And theologians use the term concurrence to talk about how God is at work while other actors, while other agents are also at work. Now, I don't want to get into like predestination and God's sovereignty and free will and those sorts of things to decide whether God permits things to happen or he causes things to happen. But what I want you to recognize in Scripture is that the Bible writers, the authors of the Bible, can describe things as happening and say that God is doing those things as well. So, for instance, it says that God causes the sun to shine on the righteous and the wicked alike. God causes the rain to come on the wicked and the righteous alike. Now, we can study meteorology, we can study weather patterns, but ultimately the writers of the Bible would want us to say that's God who brings the rain and brings the sun. Last week, Garrett talked about Psalm 139, says that God forms us in our mother's womb. And we can talk about embryology and how a baby develops and the systems that make that happen. But ultimately, we want to say God is the one behind that. God is the one doing that. In fact, God actually is behind even the actions of human beings, even the actions of what we think of as free creatures. So like in Philippians chapter 2, verse 13, Paul says this. He says, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purposes." So as you are being obedient to God, you're like being generous or kind or forgiving or helping people, Paul says that's God working in you and through you to accomplish his purposes. You're doing it, but God is the one behind it. And Paul also writes in another place, he says, I worked harder than any of you, but he says, but it was God working through me, God working in me. So God is behind all things that happen. God is behind the scenes. Why does that matter? Well, it means that we can stop talking about luck and chance. That things don't happen by chance. We don't need to wish each other luck. Well, good luck. The world is not ordered in a random sense. It doesn't just happen. That God is behind all things. That we can pray for God to bring things about, and that when bad things happen in our life, we can say, God, what are you doing? Why are you letting this happen? And when good things happen and opportunities, we can say, God, what are you up to? Maybe you're behind this. Maybe you are doing something. God is behind everything that happens. And then finally, God has a purpose for everything. God has a purpose for everything. We see throughout the pages of Scripture that God takes bad things, evil things that humans do, and he uses it for good. We see that in the story of Joseph, where Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and yet Joseph later recounts that God is the one who sent him to Egypt in advance to actually result in the saving of many lives. That God has a purpose for everything, which is why the Apostle Paul can say in Romans that God works in all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. Why does that matter? It means you can trust God with the future. You can trust God with the future of the election, with the future of the country, with the future of your family, with the future of the coronavirus. You can trust God because he has a purpose for everything. Friends, keep calm and carry on. God is in charge of the universe.